Good afternoon and welcome to the Chester County Marketing Lunch and Learn on-air show. My name is Carla Wilson, owner of Wilson Media Services, and I'm joined by my colleague,
Corrine Tassona. Hello. I am a marketing consultant and copywriter, and I know Carla through Chester County Marketing Group. It's a great group of people, so come on out to one of our meetups, and I can't wait for you to hear what she has to say about podcasting.
Thank you for that, Corrine.
Sure.
That's very sweet. You'll notice that Corrine does not look like Jeff. Unfortunately, Jeff Tincher had a death in the family, so we're sending love and light and prayers and thoughts to Jeff and his family. And Corrine agreed to be a co-host with me today for our show. This on-air show we run once a month, typically 2 weeks after our in-person Chester County Marketing Group show. In-person event, pardon me. Just to make you aware, if you've not been on a Google Plus Hangout on air before, there is a Q&A panel just below the video player where you can enter comments or questions, and Corrine's going to read those to me and feed those to me as we go through the presentation. If you are not seeing that Q&A panel, it might mean that you're watching via our website at chescomarketing.com/on-air, or you're watching via our YouTube channel, and if so, you'll see a yellow graphic just above the video player at the bottom. If you click that yellow graphic, it will navigate you over to our Google event page where you will find the Q&A panel. So again, thank you, Corrine, for being here today, and another reason I asked Corrine to be the co-host today is because she's kind of seen most of this presentation already. So, so Corrine's adding some color, what do we call it, color commentation?
Color commentary, yes.
Yeah, very good, very good. So be sure to ask questions. I really want to make sure, really the purpose of my presentation today is to convince you to launch a podcast this year, or maybe even help your clients launch a podcast this year. So bear with me one moment. I'm going to share my slides for everyone.
And just a reminder, you can ask questions after the broadcast on the Google Plus page, and Carla will answer them later for you.
Oh, thanks for that reminder, Corrine. I forgot about that part. Yes, even after the live broadcast of this show, we will be able to interact with you on the Q&A panel. So are you seeing the slides correctly, Corrine?
I see them.
Okay, fantastic. So yes, welcome to my Podcasting 101 workshop. This is to convince you to start podcasting. Or at least I'm going to do my best to convince you to start podcasting. Here's just a little bit about me. I attended college as a music major with an emphasis in sound recording technology, and that was 20 years ago. And my husband as well graduated with the same degree. So basically for the last 20 or so years, we've been accumulating lots of audio equipment. We do voiceover work. My husband composes music. We have done multi-track recordings and demos for people. So even though we may work, even though my husband, I should say, works in other fields, audio has always been a big passion of ours and always been a big part of our lives. So it was about 2009, I had already started my online business as a virtual assistant helping entrepreneurs with administrative and marketing tasks. And about 2009, 2010, I noticed that a lot of my speaker, author, and coach clients were using more audio and video in their marketing. They weren't doing the best job of it because, well, God bless them, they were just looking for, free or low-cost tools, and they weren't always doing the best job. So I realized that with my background in audio, I could be helping people produce high-quality audio, high-quality video, and then over the past couple of years, I've been teaching folks how to repurpose that content into other pieces of marketing that they can use in their marketing mix and share amongst their other marketing channels without having to reinvent the wheel. So what I'm going to cover today is really some high-level high-level discussion about my podcast workflow. So we're going to, go back to the basics. What is a podcast for those of you that might not know what it is? I'll give you an overview of some of my of the basic workflow, and then some of my examples of client workflow, and I'll as well touch upon some WordPress podcast plugins. We will talk about submitting a podcast feed to iTunes, which is the largest directory of podcasts in the world. We'll also talk about some other podcast resources. So let's start with what is a podcast. According to the dictionary, I should say Merriam-Webster, that specific dictionary, they define it as a program of music or talk made available in digital format for automatic download over the internet. And this is really a nice, succinct definition for what a podcast is. The part of the definition I would like to add to that is that it is subscription-based. So this is very similar to, an RSS feed on your blog. So whenever you add a new blog post to your blog, that is pushed out to anybody who has subscribed to you. Podcast works the same way. It's just using an audio file instead of a text file. So here are a couple of reasons why I think you should launch a podcast. Last fall, Apple surpassed 1 billion, with a B, podcast subscriptions via iTunes, and Forbes reported that there are nearly 250,000 podcasts worldwide. About that same time, the Serial podcast was being released by WBEZ out of Chicago. And I really honestly believe that had a lot to do with the increase in listenership of podcasts. So here's the third reason why I think you should launch a podcast this year. By providing content in an audible format, you're opening your business to a wider audience of people who prefer to relax and listen to your content. I took a class last fall with Alex Bloomberg, who is actually, Bloomberg, who is the host of the Startup Podcast. He's done a lot of teaching at Columbia University about podcast and storytelling, and he said something rather interesting that has really stuck with me, and that is audio is a very visual format, especially when you're telling a story. Maybe it's the story of your business, because what that makes the listener do is create an image in their head. It's impossible. I should say, it's a very strong visual format, even though if you think about it, you're just using one sense, the auditory sense.
Yeah, Carla, I'd add to that too. It's not going away. Audio is not going away. I have so many friends, and you just said this to me the other night after your way home from your presentation, who listen to audio on the way home. Either it's an audio book or it's a podcast. So the popularity is just booming.
It really is, and I think, well, again, it was after subscribing to Serial and just being so completely hooked, and I could not wait for the next episode. Now, that podcast is produced in a couple of different ways. It's produced differently than, say, an entrepreneur's podcast, in that it's produced in a season of episodes, so they had 12, while other podcasts are produced weekly, and there isn't like a season assigned to them. But what happens is you get really hungry for them. That's really what I listen to when I'm exercising, when I'm walking, are podcasts. I listen to a bunch of marketing podcasts, and I'm looking for more because I'm starting to exhaust my episodes. so I think I probably have 25 podcasts in my feed I'm listening to now. So yes, you are correct. I produce podcasts and I listen to podcasts a whole lot. So let's cover a little bit about my podcast workflow. So the first step in this process is recording. And really what I want to do is talk about very basic terms. Actually, hang on. I'm going to try this, Corrine. Yay, you can see me. Okay. So here are some of the ways that I suggest people record audio. Yes, I have a studio basically in my house of audio equipment. So I use that when I am doing voiceovers or when I'm recording stuff for podcasts. But really, here are some of the options for you. Use the voice recorder on your iPhone. You could use a digital voice recorder. This one is by Sony. I got it on Amazon for about $75. It records in both WAV and MP3 format. These used to have little mini cassettes in them. Do you remember?
I remember.
You remember? Yes, I do too.
I had one.
And then, if you are ready to invest in some equipment, you can move up to something like this. This is called, it has a different model number now. This is by Edirol, the R-09HR. Yes, I did say it correctly. This is about $300, and when I'm doing interviews, this is what I use. Now, if we are, producing a demo for somebody, we're going to use our digital multi-track recorder. But this, this little guy was only $300, so it's really, it was an investment for our business. But again, you don't need to go to that level to get really good quality audio. I guess another thing, if you wanted to, if you noticed. In fact, I'm going to put the screen on Corrine for a moment. Corrine has a headset with a microphone, what's called a boom microphone. Those work great. Those work really great, especially for the microphone, because it kind of blocks out any background noise around your head. Those headsets are awesome. So those are, I don't know, typically about $20.
Yep.
Here's another option for you if you wanted. I'm not sure who initially told me about this, but it's a $20 microphone. This is a lapel mic. Now, it's a little bit, I'm having a little bit of a hard time because this has a 20-foot wire with it, so I have it all wrapped up. So it's a lapel mic, clips right on your lapel, and then the other end, the connector, goes in your iPhone or in your digital audio recorder, and that would also give you some very good directional audio pickup. So there are lots of low-cost and free options, and that's really where I suggest people start, because the higher the expense of the equipment, typically the more involved editing software you need to edit, and the more detailed the editing gets, the less fun it is to produce. And then if you're not having fun, then you just stop doing it, whatever it is. So my suggestion is start with equipment you have already, and see how it goes. If you're liking it and you're liking the quality, and you maybe want to invest in different recording devices, and you've got 9 months worth of podcasts, and you're not going to be stopping anytime soon, I would say go forward and then start considering other microphones. So I'm going to hop back to my slides here.
Yeah, I really liked when you said that the other night too, because I think that happens to all of us. We get excited about something, we invest money in it, and then we get unexcited. And it's important to note that you don't have to publish your first podcast. You can play around with it first and play around with recording, play around with how you talk, who you talk with. And it's easy to do that starting with your iPhone if that's what you have already.
Exactly. And actually, Corrine will talk about that from a strategy point of view as well. You don't want to launch a podcast with just one episode. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So it would behoove you to practice a couple of times with recording. Start, like you said, with your iPhone. If you don't like it, see how you can improve it. There are, not that the microphone I showed you is not the only microphone out there built to fit into an iPhone. And who knows, you may have other recording devices as well. So let's see if I missed anything. Okay, here are some other options that some of my clients use when they are producing their podcast. And these are tools you might already have at your fingertips. The first is a conference call line. Conference call technology has really increased over the past few years. Those free conference call lines that offer recordings of a call don't necessarily sound like it's a telephone line anymore. The audio quality is really pretty good. I can hear a difference, but I know what I'm listening for. But technically, with a podcast, you're just talking about capturing the frequencies of a voice. You're not talking about capturing, say, the frequencies of the whole dynamic range of an orchestra. So a conference call line for a conversation, maybe it's you interviewing somebody else, is perfectly fine for producing a podcast. So consider that. Another client of mine uses Skype. Actually, several of my clients use Skype. One uses the Pamela Recorder. I think Mac has a call recorder application, and then I discovered another add-on tool called, and I believe it's pronounced Evair, and Evair records either audio and or video of your Skype conversations, which makes it easier, especially if you are doing an interview style podcast. So the next step in the podcast workflow is editing the podcast. This can take many forms. And when I say that, well, first let's talk about software. The initial piece of software that I use to edit audio is Audacity. This is an open source software. It is very easy to use. It's a great down and dirty audio editor. And it's free for use. The only caveat with Audacity is that it only edits in WAV format, and I'll explain in a little bit that once you're done editing a file, you want to export it to MP3, but Audacity can't do that on its own. So you have to. It may get a little bit. It may get a little bit detailed when you're first installing Audacity, and then you have to install this thing called an encoder to go along with that, and that can get a little bit technical and frustrating at first if you're not sure what you're doing. So that's one reason why Audacity might be frustrating for people. But just know that it is available to you. And actually, the workaround I found, too, is if you have Audacity and you've exported a file, but you don't have this encoder thing, that's my technical term, encoder thing, what you can do is import that file into iTunes, right-click, and say Convert to MP3. The iTunes encoder is absolutely fine for converting audio files. So, just keep that in mind as an option for you. Another editing piece of software, and this is available to my Mac friends, is GarageBand. Several of my clients use that for recording their podcasts. And if you want a paid option, I use Adobe Audition. Now, I pay a subscription to Adobe because I subscribe to their Creative Suite for both my audio and video editing applications. It's $50 a month. But, again, for this podcast editing, it's really not that involved. Even if you're adding in some, you might want to add in some intro or outro music, or maybe announcements or sponsorship announcements. Even if you're doing that, these software programs can handle multiple audio tracks at once. So let me mention one more point about editing. Depending on the client, when I am editing podcasts, sometimes I'm listening word for word and I'm editing out ums or ahs or maybe, just noises of the mouth that happen when you're recording, or maybe breath sounds. And it really depends on the client. One client does want me to move through and edit through and make sure it's a very clean recording, while other clients are like, no, you know what, this is just me sitting with a cup of coffee talking to my audience, so I'm really not that concerned about it sounding perfect because I'm not perfect. So, it's really up to you and the format of your podcast to decide how involved you want the editing of a podcast to be.
Great point.
So let's move on to what I call the next step in dealing with the podcast workflow, and that's tagging.
Love the visual.
I know, isn't it awesome? And thank you, Corrine, for introducing me to Haiku Deck. They have the best images. They really do. So for tagging, now tagging on an audio file, they're called ID3 tags, are very similar to the properties of a Word file. So it adds detail to the audio file. And this helps iTunes, this helps other audio players, and other media hosts gather the details about your audio file. This is something that you can use iTunes to do, but because I am producing ongoing podcasts and the clients basically have the same information, the only thing I'm changing out is maybe the track number, like the episode number, or I'm changing out the title of the audio. I really want to keep all the other details the same, and I really want to keep that consistent. I use a tool called ID3 Editor. It's by a company called pa-software.com. It's a great tool, and it allows you to save a template. So, as you can see on the screen, I am the producer of Lancaster Story Slam. So this is the template that I've saved for Lancaster Story Slam that I bring up each month. When I'm done editing the podcast, then I add the ID3 tags using this tool, and then this makes it easier on the listener, because one of the things I noticed, back in 2009, 2010, when a lot of these online coaches or speakers were sending out audios to their audience, they wouldn't take this extra step, and literally this takes just a few minutes, but they wouldn't take this extra step. So I'd end up receiving or downloading an audio file, and it would be just a string of characters. It would be a website, wherever they're hosting their audio.com, and then just a string of characters that told me nothing about the audio. Who was the author? Who's the artist? So I ended up having all these audios, but I really couldn't tell who it was from. That is like one mistake not to make when you're producing a podcast. Be sure to follow up with these details so that the audience knows how to contact you, or even know who recorded the audio. It's really important. The next step in the podcast production process is hosting. Hosting is a place where you can hold or store your audio file to allow people to access it. There are several, and here is the WordPress plugin that I wanted to mention. This is used by several of my clients. It's called Blueberry without the E's, and the plugin itself is called PowerPress. They also offer hosting very nominally.
Easy to say.
Yeah, easy to say. Nominally priced. Again, it depends on how often you're producing, if you can use a free host or you need to buy a paid host. But of course, if you're buying a subscription with a host, of course that's going to give you more features, no ads. It's going to give you, usually these hosts will give you your own web page for your podcast. If you don't have that, you'd have that available to you.
Okay, Carla.
Yes, Corrine.
I have a question for you.
Okay.
Does it make sense to start out with a free host and then, as you go along, upgrade to a better host, or a host with cost that has maybe more features, or should you do the research up front and then choose?
That's a very good question. I know it is possible, excuse me, with Blueberry and Libsyn, if you are on a free host and you decide to move to a paid account, you are able to import in your past episodes. But, of course, with any kind of conversion like that, it's just a little bit of it's a process to get everything converted over for you. But it is, of course, it is something that you can start with. You start with a no-cost option. One of my clients has, they have a server in their house, so they just host the audios on their own server. I have other clients that use Amazon S3, and even Amazon S3 I think is a good option. If you already have a website, Amazon S3 is a great option because I think you have, I don't know, it's some inordinate amount of storage space, that threshold, that once you hit that, that's when they'll start making you pay for the account.
Oh, okay.
So that's really, for audio or video, that's a good place to host stuff. And then with my work with the Story Slams, we use Podbean right now, which is another option. And then the next step in the podcast production process is posting. And first and foremost, of course, the post is probably going to show up on your podcast host, either Libsyn or Blueberry if you're using one of the paid tools. And that's going to feed out to the other podcast directories that you have subscribed to and want your podcast to show up in. But as far as you marketing the podcast, first and foremost, that podcast needs to go on your website or blog. And then that link from your website is what you are pushing out on the social networks and what you are publishing in your newsletter. Because ultimately, as with most internet marketing, when you want people to interact with you, you want them coming back to your website. And of course you do want them subscribing to you on iTunes as well, but I always think it's a really good marketing strategy to have these things, have these podcasts posted to your own website.
Definitely.
So I'm just going to cover a quick workflow. This is a client, and you will find a link to her iTunes subscription. This is Strategic Business Building, and yes, just wanted to confirm. This is the Strategic Business Building podcast and the workflow that I use for that. This is an interview style podcast where Jama interviews an industry expert. At the end of the conversation, the industry expert is offering a freebie to the audience. So then Jama announces a URL that is on her website, which is basically a landing page for this particular industry expert's page, and then there is a freebie for the person to download. So not only are you getting 20 minutes of learning on a topic, expertise, but then typically that person's offering a freebie at the end of the conversation, which is really nice. So Jama records, this is an interview style, she records using Skype and Pamela, and then she also uses Free Conference Pro as a backup, which is awesome because every now and then Skype will drop out. And she can say to me, hey, the recording dropped out at 8 minutes in, it was out for about 15 seconds, can you grab that from the backup recording? And it does make it very easy to, it's just helpful as a backup. I can go and grab that little section of audio from the backup recording and put it in with the main recording. And I know what I'm listening for, and I can usually hear it, but typically your audience won't be able to hear that. So again, I take that recording. We have both intro and outro music that Jama uses at the beginning and end of the audio, and then what I do is do some editing as far as the levels are concerned, making sure that that things sound consistent and there's a good level, especially if someone's listening via speakers at their computer or using earbuds with their iPod. After that kind of editing, I export it to MP3. I add the ID3 tags as we discussed, and then I send the file back to her team. They upload it to Libsyn, which feeds out to the podcast directories, and then they create a blog post. They do indeed use the the PowerPress plugin, put in the media link in there. It makes a very pretty little audio player. That's one of the nice features of PowerPress. And then they click publish. So again, you will find that link. As an example, you'll find that link at the Strategic Business Building podcast link to the right, I believe, is where it shows up on your screen. Pardon me. For our client workflow number 2, this is one of my clients, Angela Magasco. She records audio using GarageBand, and just to give you a heads up, she uses that little lapel mic that I showed you a little bit earlier to capture her audio. Basically the same thing here. I'm adding in intro and outro music. Angela also has intro and outro sponsorship call to action messages. I do some leveling, I export, I add the ID3 tags, they upload it to their own server, and then I create a blog post on their WordPress site using PowerPress to create an audio player, and then I hit publish. And it's actually with this particular client, it is a category on her WordPress site that is the feed that was given to iTunes. So anytime we create a blog post with the category podcasts, that's what notifies iTunes that we have a new episode. And then the last workflow I wanted to share with you, because I'm so proud of it, is for Lancaster Story Slam. I'm actually doing the podcast production for some of the other Story Slams as well, but I wanted to share this workflow with you. For Story Slam, if you've not been to it, is an in-person storytelling event. We are video and audio recording these events. So the audio is typically captured via the digital audio recorder I showed you earlier. My husband runs sound for the live event, at least in Lancaster, and he's able to run a cable from the mixing board to my recorder, which gives me awesome, awesome, awesome audio. Also, if Jim is recording Westchester, some of the other story slams, he's using a high-quality camera that captures the audio. So then what he does is just send off the audio track to me to edit. The editing with this one is a little more creative because we've got 3 storytellers, we've got little intros for each storyteller, we've got sponsorship messages, so there's just a few more tracks going on that I have to edit. But again, basically the same workflow: intro, outro music, making sure the levels are even, export to MP3, add the ID3 tags, and then we upload to Podbean, and that's feeding out to the iTunes directory. Excuse me while I have allergy voice. I just needed some tea there for a moment.
That time of year.
Indeed. So I'll talk briefly about the iTunes setup. This can be a little frustrating. It's also one of those things that's like you do all this work on the front end to get something prepared, but then once it's set up, you're basically good to go. iTunes can be frustrating to set up because about a year or 2 ago, they stopped supporting podcasters. So anybody who was there's no one to contact at Apple if you have an issue with your podcast. So here are some suggestions that I figured out in helping, my dozen or so clients get their podcast on iTunes. And this is really kind of the marketing discussion we can have. You kind of want to think through what your format will be, how often, how frequently you're going to be publishing. And I would suggest, we touched upon this earlier in the conversation, I would suggest that you not launch a podcast with 1 episode. Really have at least an intro like, hi, I'm Carla Wilson, I'm going to do this podcast about ABC, and I'm going to be publishing it bi-weekly or weekly or whatever, so an intro podcast episode, and then probably 3 or 4 episodes that you should have prepared, and then have one in the queue and have that one ready to go as well, so that you're not feeling too much pressure. But the reason I suggest this is because while none of the podcast feeds that I've given to iTunes have been denied, when you submit a podcast feed to iTunes, you will get an automated message that says, hey, we got your podcast feed. You'll probably hear from us within 2 weeks, whether it's been accepted into the directory. It's never taken iTunes 2 weeks to accept any of the feeds that I've submitted, which is a good thing. But what happens is if they accept it 3 days later, and you're like, yay, my podcast is on iTunes, you want to be able to send people to iTunes to subscribe to your podcast with more than 1 episode. You really want them to understand what you're all about. So again, from a marketing standpoint, have 3 or 4 episodes prepared, and also, again, pre-submission to iTunes. Make sure you have all your marketing copy created, because unfortunately, I'm going to go back a slide here to kind of show you. This is where you submit a podcast. You navigate to the iTunes store, to podcasts, and down here you can see it. Unfortunately, it's under the gray part, but it says submit a podcast. And what happens is you submit the feed, and then the next thing that they ask for, title of your podcast, description, categories, long description, short description, and there isn't a save and go back later button in iTunes. You don't have that option, so you really should have all of this stuff prepared before you are uploading to iTunes. I also, just to make a note here, you probably have noticed, if you are a podcast listener, when you go to iTunes, they have the new and noteworthy section. I, as yet, have a client who has made it to new and noteworthy, but here are some points to keep in mind if you want your podcast to show up there. Do the things that I have told you here. Prepare at least 4 episodes, have a couple in the queue, so that people kind of get a feel for what your frequency is, whether it's, pardon me.
I was wondering what that was.
So sorry.
We do have a question when you're ready, too.
Okay, great. And, new and noteworthy, sorry. Have several episodes available. Have a good following. Of course, that's very, objective, whatever a substantial following is, but a substantial following that you can say, hey, my podcast is on iTunes. Would you go and listen? And if you've listened, would you please give me a review? And that's another thing, is do you have some reviews there? And then I think the 4th is the number of downloads for your episode. So just keep those things in mind. You want to do a little bit of strategy, have a strategy discussion before you say, ooh, my podcast is ready, let's just push it out to iTunes.
Right.
Think about it a little bit.
That's true with any piece of marketing.
Exactly.
Strategy.
Exactly. So yes, what is the question, Corinne?
The question is, and it comes from Kevin, and I don't want to mispronounce his last name, Koshut, something like that. Is there a recommended audio recording length to maintain audience interest?
Oh.
Great question.
Fabulous question. Kevin, I wish there was a magic answer. So sorry. I didn't even follow my own, pre-hangout on air process. Good golly. Okay, length of podcast. I have clients that do a 7-minute podcast. The Story Slam podcast runs for 20 minutes. I know there are podcasts out there that run 40 minutes to an hour.
Yeah, I think it goes back to, again, how you treat all your marketing is know your audience and also match that up with what kind of content you have and how long can you be interesting.
Absolutely. What does you maybe want to say, send out a newsletter to your audience. Hey, I'm considering launching a podcast. How often would you like content from me? And what is the length of podcast you listen to? That's one way to kind of determine it. I even know there are podcasts out there that are, I want to say it's like your 2-minute leadership tip.
Yeah.
It's 2 minutes long. So, hey, and there's something to be said for the shorty podcast like that, because you could sit down and record like 10 episodes at a time. So I think it goes back to, as Corinne said, as with any marketing, be strategic about it and think about the sustainability of it. There are some big online marketers out there that are producing a podcast every day, which
wow.
More power to you. More power to you, but for me, that's just not a realistic schedule. So, you just kind of want to really think it through. So I'm sorry, Kevin, it wasn't a nice, succinct, direct, specific answer. It's one of those it depends answers.
Yeah. Hopefully that helps, though.
Exactly. So here, again, is what I wanted to demonstrate to you. Here is the field. You log into iTunes, you submit the feed URL here, and then you hit that continue button down here, and then it's asking for all these pieces of marketing. So you really need to just have a plan in advance. Just have a plan in advance and know where you want this podcast to go. So are there any other questions? Maybe, Corinne, something came up for you?
You know what? I did have a question for you. You know what? This is not a podcasting question, but I was wondering if you are going to be posting the slides somewhere. I know the recording will be available. Will you also have the slides for someone who just wants to keep the slides as reference?
Oh, of course. I'll put them somewhere accessible. I'll definitely have them on our Chester County Marketing group pages,
okay.
LinkedIn, Facebook, and you might, and I guess I'll put it on SlideShare. I guess I can put the slides there as well.
Yeah. Oh, and Kevin says that was helpful, so yay!
Yay! So glad I could help. So glad I could help with that.
I would just add too, from the marketing perspective, from a content perspective, have a strategy for content too. It's not just about prepping the technical aspects of podcasting and having the number of episodes ready, but it's also what kind of content can you speak to on a regular basis? What does your audience want? And what's your strategy going to be for continuing this out over a long period of time?
Absolutely. That's a really good point, and that goes back to what we really would love people to learn when they come to our meetings, right? Just really have that plan in place, All right, I'm going to spend 1 second on this. All right, more than 1 second. 10 seconds on the next slide. Last fall, I created a product to teach entrepreneurs how to create and launch their own podcast. It's called Podcast Made Simple. You can find it at podcastmadesimple.net.
Cool. I remembered another question.
Oh, sure. Go for it.
You mentioned quite a bit the intros and outros. So as far as creating your own intro and outro, if you're using music, is there a good site where you can go to get free snippets of music for that?
Okay. Yes. Well, this is kind of a touchy area. This is similar to finding images for your blog posts.
Yeah.
Yes, you will find, you can Google PodSafe Music.
Oh, okay.
PodSafe music, or free PodSafe music as well. And you will find some tools to help you. Typically, what I suggest is a couple of websites, and you buy a license for the piece of music, and then you're certain that the artist has been paid, and
okay,
and you have a piece of music that you can use, and it's going to sound nice and consistent, and it's kind of your sound. The first website is called Pond, and then the number 5, pond5.com. They actually have tons of stock media, tons. They have audio and video and images. I usually go there for audio. You can search by keyword. So if you wanted an inspirational sounding piece of music or something that represented leadership, you can search by keyword. I don't go there because I could spend hours there just listening. Literally millions of pieces of music to get there. There's also another website called Music Bakery. And then another resource I was just introduced to called Mixplace, MIKSPLACE.com. And Mick actually commented on a blog post of mine just to introduce himself, and he is a composer of music and provides stock music for people's podcasts and videos and things. So that's another resource for you. And when I say go to these sites and purchase a piece of music, it's $20 or $30, depending on the length of time.
Okay.
And again, it just gives you peace of mind. Here, I'm going to I should turn this off now. It gives you peace of mind that you have a properly licensed piece of work. Someone isn't going to come back to you 5 years from now and say, hey, I'm going to fine you because you did not have a properly licensed piece of music that you used on your podcast, and then you produce 50. You've had 150 episodes since then. So just again, make sure you're doing the right thing. Make sure you're getting good sources of music.
Okay.
Good sources of music. So definitely reach out if you have questions. If you are in the Chester County, Pennsylvania area, our next in-person event will be later in April. I'm looking at my wall calendar. Jeff and I are deciding whether it will be the 21st of April or the 28th of April, but please follow our Chester County Marketing Group page here on Google Plus or LinkedIn or Facebook and get more details. Or if you have any questions about this episode, again, please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A panel. And that's the beautiful thing about Hangouts on Air. I can answer this question after the fact. So I would love to have questions for you. Corrine, thank you so much for being
sure thing.
my host today and helping with that color commentary. It was much appreciated. And thank you, too, to our audience for tuning in and tweeting out the fact that we were having this lunch and learn today. I hope it was helpful for you, and we will see you again in May. Bye-bye, everybody.
All right. See ya.